a retired Navy SEAL, came to a quiet lakeside town for just 2 nights, but his loyal German shepherd led him toward a man carrying years of silence. The old man wasn't begging for help, and he didn't want to be saved. He was guarding something fragile, unfinished promises, buried grief, and one last act of purpose before his hands gave out. What began as a simple stop became a story about shame, dignity, and the kind of healing that arrives without noise. Sometimes the smallest miracle isn't a rescue, it's someone choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. And sometimes God sends hope in quiet ways, through a dog, a workshop light, and a heart that dares to open again. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep sharing more heartfelt stories. He had told himself it would be 2 nights. No more than that. Alder Creek was the sort of town that made a man distrust beauty on sight. Early autumn had polished everything too carefully. The lake lay under the morning sun like a sheet of hammered blue metal, cold and gleaming. Birch trunks lifted white and narrow from the slopes above the road. Maples burned in disciplined shades of red and rust and gold, as if even the trees had agreed to behave themselves in public. The air smelled of cedar, clean water, and distant wood smoke. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost indecent, because places that looked this peaceful usually kept their grief in the floorboards. Wes Halbrook drove into that beauty, with one hand steady on the wheel and the other resting near the German shepherd's neck. Coda sat upright in the passenger seat, large and composed, ears half forward, amber eyes working over the town with the calm vigilance of a creature that had long ago learned the difference between noise and danger. He was aging well, though a little silver had begun to show around the muzzle when the light hit him right. There was nothing decorative about him. He occupied space the way old soldiers did, without apology, without waste. Wes was 52 and built in the same practical spirit. Broad through the shoulders, spare through the waist, he wore a plain green t-shirt beneath a canvas jacket he had not bothered to button, black jeans, and combat boots that had seen enough weather to stop pretending otherwise. He carried himself like a man who had spent half his life being told where to stand, and the other half learning how not to flinch when no one told him anything at all. He had come because a dead man had asked something simple of him. 3 weeks earlier, in a hospital room in Spokane that smelled faintly of antiseptic and wilted flowers, his old teammate Ray Dempsey had pressed a small walnut box into his hands and told him, in a voice thin with morphine and stubbornness, to take it to Nolan Pierce in Alder Creek. "He'll know what it's for," Ray had said. "Don't ship it, don't trust the mail, and don't let anyone make a ceremony out of it." Wes had promised. That was the trouble with promises to dying men. They took root deeper than the ones offered to the living. The Veterans Hall sat just off the town square, a low brick building with a faded flag snapping in the clear wind. Nolan Pierce met him at the front door before he could knock, as if he'd been watching from the window. Nolan was in his early 60s, tall and narrow in the shoulders, with iron-gray hair cropped close and a face that had been weathered into honesty rather than charm. He walked with a slight favoring of his left leg, not enough to weaken him, only enough to remind the world that time always collected some kind of payment. His handshake was dry and firm. "You made good time," Nolan said. Wes lifted the walnut box. Traffic had the decency to stay dead. That won him the smallest suggestion of a smile. Inside, the hall was quiet, except for the hum of an old refrigerator and the soft rattle of a vent somewhere in back. Framed photographs lined the walls, parades, fish fries, memorial breakfasts, men in uniforms that belonged to different wars but the same country. Nolan took the box with both hands, and the careful way he did it told Wes more than any explanation might have. Whatever was inside mattered because of who had kept it, not because it was rare. They talked for 20 minutes. About Ray mostly. About the uselessness of phrases like, "he went peacefully." About the fact that men who had survived things with fire and metal in them often ended up being defeated by quieter machinery. Nolan offered him coffee. Wes accepted out of politeness and drank half of it out of discipline. He was getting ready to leave when Nolan said almost offhandedly, "If you're staying the night, Diner on Birch has decent pie. Don't bother with the Marina Cafe unless you enjoy paying extra for eggs that taste insalted." 2 nights, Wes said. "Then I'm gone." Nolan gave a nod that meant he had heard the words and did not entirely believe them. Town has a way of deciding otherwise sometimes. Wes almost asked what that meant, but Coda had already risen from the old rug by the heater and was looking toward the door. Outside, the light had sharpened. Wes walked the dog down toward the lake shore because it seemed easier than sitting in a motel room waiting for evening. The road dipped past a row of painted storefronts and then bent into a quieter stretch behind the marina, where old boathouses leaned into the wind like men who had worked too long on bad knees. The lake was close enough now that he could smell its mineral cold. Coda slowed, then stopped. Wes stopped with him. The dog's body had gone still in that particular way Wes knew too well, not fear, not excitement, but attention narrowed to a point. Coda lifted his head, nostrils flaring once, then turned away from the path and started toward a weather-beaten pier behind an abandoned bait shed. "Easy," Wes murmured, though the command was more habit than necessity. At the end of the pier, an old man was crouched on one knee, reaching awkwardly beneath the warped planks. He had looped one hand around the edge of a narrow metal cylinder, the length of a fishing rod case, sealed at both ends and stained by lake damp. It was tied with old cord under the pier beams, hidden from casual sight. He had likely stashed it there on purpose and come back now that the water line had dropped. He was too far over. Wes knew that before the man did. The next second, the old boards gave a hard groan, and the man's boot slipped. His shoulder lurched toward open water. Wes crossed the distance almost without memory of deciding to move. He caught the man by the forearm and hauled him back before the pier could take its argument any further. The old man twisted with startling force. "Let go of me." The voice came out raw, not weak. His face lifted into the light, deep-lined, hawk-boned, with a strong nose and a mouth that looked made for restraint rather than kindness. He had a full head of white hair badly in need of a comb, and he wore a brown wool coat rubbed thin at the elbows, work pants stained with varnish, and boots old enough to have forgotten softness. One hand trembled, but his eyes did not. They were gray and bright and furious at being seen off balance. "You were about to go in," Wes said, releasing him only when the man found both feet. "I was about to mind my own business." That nearly became a water recovery issue. The old man straightened slowly, breath tight with pain or temper. "And yet here I remain, tragic for both of us." In another life, or maybe in a younger version of this one, Wes might have answered harder, but something in the man's stance gave him pause. It was not pride exactly. Pride still performed for an audience. This was more private than that. The look of someone who had been alone with his own failing for so long that witnessing itself had started to feel like theft. Coda approached then, not with the eager optimism dogs sometimes brought to human damage, not with wagging insistence or a clumsy attempt to fix the mood by existing. He simply walked to within a few feet of the old man and sat down, that was all. The wind moved over the lake. Somewhere across the water a gull cried once, thin as torn paper. The old man looked at the dog, his expression changed. Not softer, not exactly, but less armed. His breathing eased by a fraction. He studied Coda with the concentration of someone reading a language he had not spoken in years. "Well," he said after a moment, quieter now, "you've got better manners than the one holding your leash." Wes almost laughed, which annoyed him on principle. Coda did not move. He only held the man's gaze with a calm so steady it began to feel like its own form of mercy. The old man bent, winced, and lifted the metal cylinder free the rest of the way. He tucked it against his side with care that bordered on tenderness. Whatever was inside mattered. "Need a hand carrying it?" Wes asked. The man's mouth sharpened. "I would rather carry a piano uphill through sleet." "Good to know your standards." "Good to know yours include interrupting strangers." For a second, the old man looked past Wes toward the town, the lake, the bright, impossible day. Then he turned back. "Levon Mercer," he said, as if the offering cost him something. "Wes Halbrook." Levon glanced once more at Coda. "Cho-tot," he said softly, the foreign syllables oddly gentle in his rough voice, then translated for himself with a tired breath. "Good dog." He started back along the pier, moving carefully now, one shoulder held tighter than the other. At the shore he paused without turning around. "Dogs know," he said. "They know when somebody's trying not to fall. Trouble is, they don't understand some people would rather manage it alone." Then he walked up the slope toward the birches, the metal cylinder tucked under one arm, like a relic he had no intention of explaining. Wes stood there longer than he meant to. Coda remained beside him, watching the place where the old man had disappeared. By the time the light began to thin toward evening, Wes found himself back at the Veterans Hall under the pretense of returning Nolan's travel mug. Nolan took one look at his face and said, "You met Levon Mercer." It was not a question. Wes leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "If by met, you mean prevented a drowning and got thanked like a tax auditor, then yes." Nolan exhaled through his nose. "That sounds about right. Who is he?" Nolan's expression settled into that careful shape people wore when the truth belonged partly to them and partly to a whole town. Best luthier this region ever had. Used to make fiddles and mandolins that could make a sober man reconsider his life. Then something happened years back. Community fundraiser. He was supposed to help. Didn't. Some folks never forgave it. Others figure grief got to him first. He shrugged once. Either way, people around here don't exactly hate Levon. They're just tired of carrying the empty place where he used to be. Outside, the evening wind came off the lake with a cleaner kind of cold. Wes looked toward the darkening road beyond the square, where birch shadows stretched long and thin over the pavement. He had told himself it would be 2 nights, but somewhere in the bright machinery of that northern town, a dog had stopped before an old man who did not want to be caught falling. And now a question had lodged itself under Wes's ribs with the stubbornness of a splinter. What kind of thing did a man hide beneath a pier, and why did he look at a dog as if he had just been recognized by the only witness he had not prepared for? He did not ask Nolan that. Not yet. Wes woke to a room that had already lost its purpose. The motel was clean in the indifferent way of places built for temporary men. A narrow bed, a wooden chair near the window, a landscape print bolted to the wall as if someone had once feared guests might steal a mountain. Morning light pushed through the curtains in pale bars, laying itself across the floorboards, and one black combat boot he had left beside the bed. Coda was already awake, sitting near the door with that patient, forward-looking stillness that suggested the day had started without him, and he had no intention of being late to it. For a moment, Wes lay there listening to the heater click and settle. He had delivered Ray's box. He had done what he came to do. By ordinary logic, he could shower, drink bad coffee, put Alder Creek in the rearview mirror by 10. Instead, he found himself staring at the ceiling and thinking about an old man's hand shaking over cold water, about a metal cylinder tied beneath a pier, about the way Levon Mercer had looked at Coda. Not like a stranger admiring a dog, but like someone startled to find himself seen by the wrong witness. Wes disliked loose ends, not because they offended his sense of order, but because they lingered. They stayed in the head and changed shape there. He got up, pulled on his plain green t-shirt, black jeans and boots, and decided the only sensible thing to do was leave after one more stop at the Veterans Hall. That decision lasted until he opened the truck door. Coda climbed into the passenger seat, then stopped, turned, and looked back at Wes instead of settling in. It was not defiance. Coda did not play games with obedience. It was assessment. A quiet question posed without drama. "Are we really done here?" "Don't start," Wes muttered, though the dog hadn't started anything. The hall was quiet when they got there. Nolan Pierce was in back sorting folding chairs into straighter lines than they needed. He glanced up, saw Wes, and nodded as if he had been expecting exactly this return. "Left something behind?" Nolan asked. Apparently, peace of mind. "That'll happen." Wes helped him stack the last 6 chairs because it was easier than admitting he had no good reason to be there. Nolan moved with the efficient patience of a man long practiced at making room for other people's memories. He wore a flannel shirt under a canvas vest, and the light from the high windows silvered the close-cut hair over his temples. When the chairs were done, Nolan wiped his hands on his jeans. "You heading out?" "That was the plan." "And?" Wes glanced at Coda, who had stationed himself by the door and was looking out toward the street with unnerving focus. "And my dog appears to think my plans lack vision." Nolan's mouth bent slightly. "There are worse advisors." Wes hesitated, which annoyed him. "Where does Levon live?" That got a fuller look. Not surprise. More like recognition of a weather front moving in. Nolan gave directions without comment. Up Birch Road, past the old orchard fence, take the lane where the gravel gives out before the Courage does. At the end of it, a house looking over the lake. Wes thanked him and left before the older man could add whatever caution had probably occurred to him. The road rose out of town in curves lined with birch and maple. Autumn had deepened overnight into something richer, less decorative. Leaves had begun to collect in the ditches and along split-rail fences. Far below, the lake shone through the trees in bright fragments. A church bell rang once from somewhere behind him and was swallowed by distance. When they reached the lane Nolan had mentioned, Coda's posture changed. Not tension, recognition. The dog leaned slightly toward the passenger window, nostrils working, then settled again with the calm of a creature arriving where he expected to be. Levon's house stood on a gentle slope above the water, weathered cedar with a pitched roof darkened by years of snow. It was not picturesque. It had gone beyond that into something more honest, a place kept standing by habit, skill, and the refusal to spend money on appearances. The porch rails needed paint. One shutter hung a little low. The yard was half grass, half fallen leaves, with a woodpile stacked under tarp and an old handcart tipped beside the shed. A narrow outbuilding sat behind the house, separate from it by 20 feet of worn earth. Even from the truck, Wes could tell that was the workshop. He had not yet killed the engine when Coda let out a single low huff and looked toward the porch. Levon Mercer stood there in shirt sleeves despite the cold, one hand braced against the doorframe. In daylight, he looked less like a man from a lakeside myth and more like exactly what he was: old, spare, sore, and unamused. His white hair had been smoothed back with water or impatience. He wore a gray Henley beneath a brown vest, work pants streaked with dust, and the same boots from the pier. One shoulder still rode higher than the other. "You again," he said when Wes got out. "Encouraging to hear I made an impression." "You made a nuisance of yourself." Different category. Wes would have answered, but Coda had already crossed the yard. He did not run to Levon or circle him with hopeful energy. He walked to the porch, turned once, and lay down near the steps as if he had been assigned that position by someone with rank. Levon looked at the dog, then at Wes. "I assume he came with you. I'm trying not to take it personally, but I'm starting to suspect otherwise." Levon's face remained stern. His eyes did something else. Not warmth, not yet. But the hostility no longer stood alone in them. "I don't need anything hauled," he said. "And if Nolan sent pie, take it back." He didn't. "I came on my own. That's worse." Still, he did not tell them to leave. Wes stayed where he was, hands loose at his sides. He had learned years ago that some men would rather be cornered physically than kindly. "I'm driving out today. Thought I'd make sure you didn't go swimming again before I left." Levon made a sound that might once have grown into a laugh and then thought better of it. "I've survived 73 years without your supervision. Seems to have made you very grateful. Gratitude is expensive. I spend carefully." The wind moved across the slope, lifting a scatter of birch leaves. Coda rested his head on his paws, entirely at home. Levon noticed that too. "He intends to stay there all morning, doesn't he?" "Looks that way." "Stubborn." Wes looked at the dog, then back at the man on the porch. "He gets that from good company." A pause opened between them. It was not friendly, but it was no longer hostile enough to slam shut on its own. Levon stepped aside from the doorway with visible reluctance. "If you're going to stand there making poor conversation, at least do it where the wind isn't wasting both our time." Inside, the house smelled of cedar dust, old paper, black tea, and something medicinal hiding beneath the rest. It was neat in the way solitary men's homes sometimes were, less because anyone cared what visitors might think, more because disorder became louder when there was no one else to absorb it. A cast-iron stove sat near the far wall. Books leaned in uneven rows on shelves built by hand. 2 framed photographs rested on the mantel, turned at an angle from where they had once been dusted and not quite set straight again. Wes did not stare at them. Levon moved carefully toward the kitchen table, where a chipped mug and a folded cloth lay beside a pair of reading glasses. That small domestic arrangement unsettled Wes more than the man's temper had. Anger was active. This was what remained when no one was around to witness anything at all. "I'm not offering coffee," Levon said. "The last of it tastes like roofing tar." "Then we agree on something." Levon lowered himself into a chair. Only then did Wes see how much the effort cost him. It was not dramatic, just cumulative. Hands finding the edge of the table, a brief tightening of the mouth, the body calculating each inch as if pain were a tax assessed by movement. "You hurt your shoulder yesterday," Wes said. "I have several body parts older than my opinions. Hard to narrow it down." Coda scratched once at the door behind them. Levon turned his head. "He can come in." Wes blinked. "You sure? If he sheds, I'll blame you." Coda entered with grave courtesy, passed Wes entirely, and settled near the stove. Something in the room changed when he did. Not brightened, relaxed, maybe, by a thread's width. It happened then, about a third into the morning. In such a small way, another man might have missed it. Levon reached for the mug. His hand trembled hard enough to rattle ceramic against wood. He set it down without drinking. No curse, no shrug, just that brief, naked interruption between intention and action. Wes looked away on instinct. Dignity survived best when not pinned in place, but he had seen enough. Levon noticed that he had seen. "There," he said quietly, sharper than before. "Satisfied? The machinery is failing. You may report it to the county." Wes did not answer right away. Something in him had shifted, though he did not yet know into what. "You work with your hands." It was not a question. Levon followed his gaze toward the back window, where the outbuildings stood gray in the slanting light. "Worked," he corrected. A few minutes later, perhaps because silence had become less dangerous than conversation, perhaps because Coda still refused to leave his chosen post, Levon rose and crossed to the rear door. "Come on, then," he said. "If I'm to be inspected like livestock, you may as well see what's left of the barn." The workshop smelled exactly as shame might if shame could be planned, sanded, and varnished. Resin, linseed oil, maple and spruce, steel strings, old glue warmed and cooled 100 times. It was a narrow, high-windowed room, crowded without being chaotic. A workbench ran the length of one wall. Tools hung in deliberate order: chisels, clamps, small files, measuring squares, spool clamps yellowed with age. Light fell in from 2 dusty panes and caught in the suspended grain of the wood stacked near the far corner. Half-finished instruments rested on padded shelves like paused sentences. Wes had never known much about musical instruments, but he knew craft when he saw it. This was not hobby work. Everything in the room had earned its place. Levon moved differently here, still stiff, still guarded, but more exact. The room gave him back a little authority simply by existing. "These yours?" Wes asked, looking toward 3 unfinished bodies on the bench. Levon's mouth flattened. "Most things in here are." He did not elaborate, and Wes did not press. Not yet. The back door opened without a knock. A woman came in carrying 2 ledger books under one arm and a canvas tote against her hip. She was in her mid-40s, slender but not delicate, with dark auburn hair twisted into a loose knot that looked practical rather than styled. Her coat was navy wool, open over a cream sweater, and she wore the kind of boots that suggested she expected uneven ground from life and dressed accordingly. Her face was fine-boned, alert, and too intelligent to bother pretending otherwise. She stopped when she saw Wes. Levon looked as if the day had found a new way to insult him. "Mara?" "So I gathered," she said dryly. Her gaze moved to Wes, then to Coda by the stove. "And who have you collected now?" "Mara Quinn," Levon said, in the tone of a man naming both an ally and a recurring inconvenience. "She owns the bookshop in town. Also interferes in matters not assigned to her by God or county ordinance." Mara shifted the ledgers to her other arm and offered Wes a small direct nod. "That usually means he's relieved I came." Wes introduced himself. "Knew that part already," she said. "Nolan called 20 minutes ago, said the stranger with the military posture and the impossible dog had gone up Birch Road. Small towns can be very efficient when they're bored." Her eyes went once around the workshop, taking inventory faster than seemed polite but not unkindly. When they landed on Levon, her voice changed, not softer, more exact. "You were supposed to rest that shoulder." "I did, yesterday for nearly 6 offensive minutes. And then the Republic survived." Mara set the ledgers on a side table with restrained patience. "You disappear for half a week, show up at the post office needing ink, and now I find you with company. This is practically a parade." Wes caught the exchange underneath the words. She knew her place here, and it had not been granted cheaply. He asked, "How long have you known him?" "Long enough to know he was easier before he perfected being difficult." Levon grunted. Mara turned to Wes again. "Before you decide he's a wounded saint in a cedar box, you should know something. Years back, this town had a fundraiser that mattered. Music, auction, the works. Levon was supposed to help make it happen. Instead, he vanished at exactly the wrong moment." She shrugged one shoulder. "People lost money, trust too. Some say grief got to him. Others say he let grief become an excuse. Around here, those are considered separate offenses." Levon did not argue. That, more than the words themselves, stayed with Wes. Mara looked around the room one last time, eyes briefly resting on the unfinished instruments, then on Coda, who had moved to lie near the workshop threshold as if guarding both entry and exit. "The tragedy of men like him," she said, almost absently, "isn't that people hate them. It's that they get so used to living inside the outline of disappointment, they start mistaking it for character." Levon's jaw tightened, but he still said nothing. Outside, a gust of wind shook yellow leaves loose from the birches and sent them scraping over the yard like dry applause. Wes stood in the workshop doorway, breathing in resin and cold and the old stubborn ache of things left unfinished. He had come to Alder Creek to keep a promise to one dead man. Now he was standing in another man's silence, sensing without proof that the real weight of this place was not in what Levon Mercer had lost, but in what he had failed to return. And for reasons he did not trust yet, that felt harder to walk away from than the lake, the pier, or even the promise that had brought him north. Wes stayed because leaving would have required a cleaner conscience than the morning offered him. He told himself otherwise, naturally. He told himself Nolan Pierce could use another pair of hands at the Veterans Hall. He told himself the truck needed gas, the road south could wait until afternoon, and there were worse ways to spend a bright autumn day than helping an old man with folding tables and warped hinges. Men like Wes had always been gifted at disguising attachment as practicality. It was one of the more respectable forms of cowardice. The hall needed work, which helped. A back storage door had swollen in its frame sometime last spring, and now took a shoulder and bad language to open. Wes took off his jacket, set his toolbox on the concrete floor, and worked the screws loose while Nolan sorted donation boxes for the winter drive. The room smelled of cardboard, old coffee, and furnace dust. Outside, the day shone hard and clean, but in here the light had to come filtered through high, narrow windows, as if even sunshine respected the habits of old institutions. Nolan watched him shave down the sticky edge of the door with a plane he'd borrowed from somebody in town years ago and never returned. "You don't do idle very well," Nolan said. "I do it fine," Wes answered. "I just prefer it disguised as maintenance." "That's so." Wes set the plane down. "You've got a way of asking questions without moving your mouth much." Nolan folded a roll of tape between his hands. "Comes with age, saves energy." There was a pause in which both men understood exactly who they were not discussing. Then Nolan said, "Levon been trouble yet?" "Depends how you define trouble." "I define it as the kind a person walks toward while pretending he isn't." Wes almost smiled. "Then yes." Nolan nodded, as if that settled something. Town remembers what he failed to do, doesn't always remember what came before that. And what came before that? Nolan looked down at the tape in his hands. A man who made beautiful things. A man people trusted. Sometimes that makes disappointment heavier than harm. He did not say more, and Wes did not push. He was beginning to understand that Alder Creek treated old stories the way some families treated war injuries. Everybody knew where they hurt, Nobody touched them unless forced. By noon, the door swung cleanly. Nolan thanked him with a paper sack containing 2 sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper and a slice of pecan pie balanced in a napkin like an act of diplomacy. "Take one up the hill if you're headed that way," he said. Wes gave him a look. Nolan shrugged. "You're not the first man to think curiosity counts as an exit strategy." The road to Levon's house looked different in midday. Less haunted, more exact. Sunlight struck the birch trunks so bright they seemed painted on. The lake below flashed like broken glass between the trees. Coda rode with his head near the open window, drawing in air that smelled of cold water, dry leaves, and distant wood smoke. He did not fidget. He only grew more intent the nearer they came. This time, Levon was not on the porch. The truck had barely stopped before Coda jumped down, crossed the yard, and stood at the side door, waiting without scratching. It was a gesture so composed it bordered on formal. Wes took 1 sandwich from the bag, left the rest in the cab, and knocked. No answer. He pushed the door a few inches and found it unlocked. "Mercer?" From somewhere behind the house came the blunt rhythm of wood being shifted against wood. Wes circled around and found Levon at the edge of the stacked cordwood, bent over a half-collapsed tarp with the concentration of a man who believed stubbornness could still count as leverage. A few split logs had rolled free down the slope. He was trying to gather them one-handed and failing with enough dignity to make the effort harder to watch than any outright fall would have been. Coda went to him first, not to help, not to fuss, simply to stand nearby with his ears forward and his body calm. Levon straightened enough to look up. "You again? You make it sound like a tax audit." You arrive with the same persistence. Wes held up the wax paper bundle. "Peace offering. I distrust pastry diplomacy. It's ham. Then I distrust livestock diplomacy." Still, he took it when Wes stepped close enough to hand it over. That, in itself, felt like a change too small to name and too rare to ignore. They gathered the escaped logs together in a silence different from the ones before. Not easy, exactly, just less armed. Levon moved with the clipped economy of a man who hated wasting motion because each one now came with a cost. Wes did not comment when the older man had to stop twice to flex life back into his fingers. Levon did not thank him for lifting the heavier pieces. When the stack was steady again, Levon sank onto the overturned crate beside the woodpile and unwrapped the sandwich with careful hands. Coda sat at his boot, watching the yard instead of the food. "You trained him not to beg," Levon said. "I trained him not to embarrass himself." "A rare skill." Wes leaned against the fence post. "You always this charming with guests?" "I don't usually allow enough of them to develop consistency." Levon ate half the sandwich in small deliberate bites, then stood with visible reluctance. "Workshop," he said. "I left the side window open. Wind will take things." Wes followed because that was what he had already begun doing in this town, following small practical sentences into larger moral weather. Inside the workshop, the air held the dry sweetness of spruce and varnish. Afternoon light angled through the high panes and laid golden bars across the bench. The room felt more inhabited than it had the day before, though not because anything had moved. It was the opposite. Every tool still hung where it belonged. Every scrap of wood lay where a certain kind of hand would expect to find it. The place was orderly enough to reveal obsession, and tired enough to reveal neglect. Levon crossed to the side wall and latched the window shut. Then he paused, brow knitting. "My gloves," he muttered. He glanced toward the yard, then toward the house. "Left them by the stove. I can get them. That would require knowing where I keep things. I'm beginning to suspect nowhere strange." Levon gave him a dry look, then turned toward the back door. "Don't touch anything important." The instruction came too quickly. That was what gave the room away. Wes waited until the old man had crossed the yard toward the house. Coda, who had followed Levon halfway, stopped at the threshold and turned back. For a moment, he stood between house and workshop, undecided. Then, with a seriousness that made the gesture feel less like instinct than judgment, he came to lie near the workbench instead. Wes did not search. He would have told himself that and believed it halfway, but his eyes kept moving through the room, picking up clues the way a body picked up cold through thin fabric. The unfinished instruments were not random. One violin body had a name written on masking tape along the inside rim. A mandolin, too. Then a small-bodied guitar with another label. 7 in all, if the half-assembled necks and boxed parts on the lower shelf belonged to the same invisible order. He crouched to see better. That was when he noticed the wooden box tucked beneath the side table. Not hidden well enough to suggest criminality. Hidden like something set out of sight because being looked at too directly would make it harder to endure. Coda lifted his head, but did not move. Wes drew the box out. Inside lay a stack of envelopes, all addressed in the same spare, disciplined hand. No stamps, no postmarks, just names. Evelyn Harker, Toby Wren, Father Paul Hales, Edwin Sloan, Ruth Bellamy, Daniel Reddick, Marlene Pike. Adults. People rooted in the town. People old enough or established enough that these were not notes of simple sentiment but reckonings deferred. The first letter he unfolded began without greeting. "I should have come that night. You were right to stop waiting after the first hour." The next was shorter. "I told myself shame was reason enough to stay away. That was cowardice dressed as mourning." Another, "You lost money because I vanished. But worse than that, I let you lose face in front of people who had trusted your name with mine." Wes read no further than 3 or 4 lines of each. He did not need to. The pattern struck with the force of accumulated weather. These were not letters from a victim. They were apologies from a man who had made a wound in public and then retreated so long into his own suffering that the retreat had become its own offense. The workshop door opened hard enough to bang against the wall. Levon stood there with his gloves in one hand and fury in the other. For a second, neither man spoke. The air in the room changed shape. Wes rose slowly, the letter still open in his fingers. "You wrote them." Levon's face had gone beyond anger into something older and more dangerous. Exposure without defense. "Put those down." "You never sent any of them." I said, "Put them down." Coda stood now, but instead of going to Wes, he crossed the room and stopped near Levon, not touching him, simply occupying the space beside the older man with infuriating calm. Wes set the letter back in the box but did not slide the box away. "So, this is it?" he asked. "You hurt people, you know it. You write apologies and then you keep them in a box until the paper turns old enough to pass for consequence." Levon's hand shook. Whether from rage or pain, Wes could not tell. "You don't know anything. I know enough. You weren't driven out, you left." Something flashed across Levon's face then. Not denial, worse, recognition. Wes heard his own voice harden and kept going because some truths, once uncovered, made restraint feel dishonest. A man can grieve. A man can fail. But he doesn't get to call it depth when other people are carrying the weight he dropped. Levon's reply came low and cutting. "Of course you'd think that." Wes frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Levon said, each word deliberate now, "you look at life like a field assignment. Problem. Response. Damage assessment. Moral clarity if the weather holds." He stepped closer, the old fury in him sharpened by intelligence rather than volume. Men like you always believe motion is virtue, that if something breaks, it must be answered immediately, preferably by whoever still has the strongest shoulders. It's a useful way to live, it's also a brutal one. Wes felt the accusation land because part of it was true. That's not what this is. No? Levon's gray eyes were bright now, exhausted and merciless both. Then what is it? Concern? Rescue? You walk into a room full of unfinished things and assume the one standing there has mistaken delay for character. Sometimes delay is all a man has left between himself and a truth he cannot survive cleanly. The room went still. Not empty, still. Coda eased down beside Levon's boots and rested there, refusing the easy symbolism of choosing sides. It unsettled Wes more than if the dog had come to him. Loyalty, he realized, was not the same thing as endorsement. Sometimes it was merely the refusal to abandon the most exposed person in the room. His anger did not vanish. It changed shape. He looked from Levon to the unfinished instruments on the shelves, to the labels he had glimpsed and now could not unknow. 7 names, 7 projects, 7 promises maybe. Levon followed his gaze, and for the first time something like defeat, not self-pity, not drama, only tired fact, showed plainly in his face. Wes understood then that whatever lay in those letters was only one part of the ledger. He slid the box back under the table without another word. The silence that followed was not resolution. It was truce by exhaustion. At length, Wes stepped toward the bench and saw the nearest label clearly enough to read it. A name, carefully written, not a customer's tag, something more personal than inventory. He looked farther down the shelf. 7 unfinished instruments stood in their places under the late autumn light, each marked for someone, each waiting with the patience of wood for a hand that might not stay steady enough to finish what it had begun. And suddenly, the letters in the box were no longer the only things in that room that had failed to leave. Wes left the workshop with the taste of his own certainty gone bitter. The afternoon had turned colder without losing any of its brightness. Alder Creek below the hill looked sharpened by light. Every roofline and church spire and painted storefront held in cruel autumn clarity. Nothing in the town seemed built for confusion, and yet confusion was exactly what Wes carried down that slope, along with the steady sound of Coda's paws behind him and the image of 7 unfinished instruments standing under the workshop light-like witnesses who had not yet been called. He had gone up the hill ready to decide what kind of man Levon Mercer was. That certainty had not survived contact. By the time he reached Main Street, his anger had lost its clean edge. It was still there, but now it had company, something harder to bear than anger and less satisfying, the possibility that he had entered the wrong argument too early. Coda stopped outside Mara Quinn's bookstore before Wes had made any conscious decision to turn. The dog stood with his head lifted toward the window, where late sun lay over displays of used hardcovers, local histories, and a handwritten sign advertising a Thursday reading no one had probably attended sober. Wes stared at the door for a moment, then went in because at that point the day was already steering itself. The bell above the door gave a thin brass ring. Mara stood on a step stool near the back shelves, sliding a stack of returns into place with the absent precision of someone who knew every inch of her own territory. In the shop light, her hair showed more copper than auburn, pulled back in a knot that had partially escaped by mid-afternoon. She wore a charcoal skirt, dark tights, and a green cardigan with one cuff pushed high enough to reveal an old silver watch. There was nothing fragile about her, though she was slim. She had the look of a woman who had spent years being underestimated by people who mistook composure for softness. Without turning, she said, "If that's you, Wes Halbrook, the answer is yes." He shut the door behind him. I didn't ask anything. You came in wearing that expression men reserve for difficult truths and hardware stores. It usually means a question is on its way. Coda wandered 2 paces in, then lay down by the register as if bookstores had always seemed like a reasonable place to guard. Mara climbed down from the stool and set a hand on the shelf beside her. You found the letters. Wes looked at her. You knew about them? I knew enough not to go reading what wasn't mine. She came forward, not hurried, not cautious either. Levon has spent years apologizing to people in private and disappointing them in public. The letters fit the pattern. That doesn't explain the instruments. No, she said, it doesn't. He waited. Mara studied him for a beat, as if deciding whether he was the kind of man who could be trusted with context or only with facts. At last, she reached under the counter for her coat. Come on, she said. Where? Somewhere the story gets less convenient. The drive to the eastern side of the lake took 15 minutes. The road narrowed after the last row of townhouses and curled past pasture, birch stands and split-rail fences silvered by age. The land there had a patient, open feel to it, as if it expected weather and outlived drama. A small sign appeared at last near a stand of cottonwoods. Bellamy House. The place was not a grand facility or a polished retirement estate. It was a long, low building of pale stone and weathered siding, with a broad porch facing the water and wind chimes that had likely sounded better in summer. The grounds were neat without being cheerful. 2 raised garden beds sat empty for the season. A wheelchair ramp cut cleanly toward the side entrance. A row of Adirondack chairs had been stacked against the wall, waiting out the colder months like folded birds. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, old wool, and chicken broth. A woman in a slate-blue cardigan was pinning a schedule to a corkboard in the front hall. She was somewhere around 70, broad through the shoulders and straight-backed despite the years, with silver hair clipped close at the jaw and eyes the color of dark tea. Her face had not softened with age, it had clarified. Everything about her suggested the sort of competence that survives panic without becoming cruel. She turned when Mara entered. Ada, Mara said. This is Wes Holbrook, the man Nolan mentioned, the one with the dog. Ada Bellamy looked first at Wes, then at Coda, and finally at Mara in a way that suggested she disliked surprises, but understood their inevitability. This better not be about another committee, she said. It isn't. Ada's attention returned to Wes. Then you should know, I don't accept donations that come with speeches, and I don't host pity disguised as outreach. Wes blinked once. Good to know we're all having a clear day. That earned him the smallest flicker of approval. Ada led them into a sitting room facing the lake. Afternoon light spilled across braided rugs and upholstered chairs that had seen harder use than fashion. A piano stood against one wall with 2 keys chipped ivory white. On a shelf nearby sat a harmonica in a velvet box, a cracked metronome, and a photo of 3 men in younger years holding fiddles on what looked like a church lawn. From deeper in the building came the faint sound of a television game show, laughter from somewhere down the hall, and then silence again. Ada did not offer coffee. Wes liked her better for it. She sat in a wooden armchair and folded her hands. Mara says you've been up at Levon's. More than once. Then I assume you've discovered he's not easy to rescue. That depends on whether he needs rescuing. Ada glanced at Mara, then back at him. There it is. Wes felt irritation stir. Would somebody mind getting to the part where 7 half-built instruments are sitting in his workshop with names on them? Ada's expression changed, not warmer, but more personal. They're for here. The answer landed with less drama than he would have expected and more force. She rose, motioning them toward a smaller activity room off the hall. Folding chairs sat in a circle near the windows. Along one wall were shelves of jigsaw puzzles, hymnals, old board games, and plastic bins labeled in careful block letters. Cards, yarn, paint, memory books. In the corner stood an empty guitar stand. "We run what we can," Ada said. "Not because it cures loneliness, nothing cures it neatly, but structure helps. Music helps more than most things if it's handled without condescension." She crossed to a cabinet and opened a drawer. Inside were folders. She took out one slim file and handed it to Wes. On the front, in Levon's careful hand, were 7 names. Not the names from the letters. Resident names. Wes opened the file. Inside was a list in terse pencil notes. Small body guitar. Easier reach for arthritic shoulder. Mandolin. Former bluegrass player. Violin. Memory response to bow hold. Lap dulcimer adaptation. Repaired tuning pegs. Low tension strings. He looked up. Ada rested one hand on the back of a chair. "I asked Levon last winter if he'd be willing to look at a broken mandolin one of our residents used to play. He came to collect it and stayed nearly an hour. Didn't talk much. Walked through this room like a man measuring an old wound. 3 days later, he brought back a notebook with names, hand sizes, former instruments, music preferences, even which residents startled easily around loud sound." Her mouth tightened, though not unkindly. "He notices like craftsmen do, thoroughly and without making a spectacle of it." Mara leaned against the doorway, arms folded, letting Ada speak. "He promised 7 instruments by first frost," Ada continued. "Not charity cases, not symbolic gifts. Usable instruments, adapted where needed, light enough for failing wrists, stable enough to hold tune in old hands. He said if there was any point to beautiful things, it was that they ought to remain reachable after pride and youth had both left the room." Something in Wes eased and tightened at once. "And he's doing all that alone?" he asked. "He intended to." "Why?" Ada's brows lifted. "Because that's how penance works when it hardens into personality." Then, after a beat, "Also, because he doesn't want this turned into one of those stories people like telling about noble suffering. He'd rather fail privately than be pitied publicly." Wes looked back at the file. The notes were too exact to be sentimental. This was not some vague dying wish designed to make the town feel forgiving. It was work. Skilled, practical, specific work. The kind that required thought more than tears. In the hallway, someone began plucking a melody on an out-of-tune ukulele. 3 searching notes, then a stop. A man's voice followed, old and embarrassed. "No, that one's gone crooked again." Ada glanced toward the sound, then said quietly, "People think old age is mostly about weakness. It isn't. It's about being repeatedly separated from the things that used to call you back into yourself." That sentence stayed in the room. Wes felt it settle somewhere lower than argument. About 2/3 through their visit, a resident wandered into the doorway without knocking. He was a tall black man in his late 70s, dressed in pressed khakis and a rust-colored sweater vest, with a cane tucked under one arm and the careful posture of someone determined to remain formal even when the body no longer saw the point. His left hand curled slightly inward, as if old injury had argued with it and won. "Afternoon, Ada," he said. His voice was warm but frayed around the edges. Then he noticed Wes and Coda. His face brightened, but not for the man. "Well now," he said to the dog, "you're the kind of company this place ought to advertise." Coda rose and went to him with measured courtesy. "This is Mr. Leland Voss," Ada said. "Used to play mandolin in a county band before his shoulder and patience both gave out." Leland snorted softly. shoulder first, patience after. He bent with visible effort to lay his good hand against Coda's neck. The dog leaned just enough to answer. Ada nodded toward the empty stand in the corner. "Tell him what you said last week." Leland looked at the stand, then away. "Told her if someone put a real instrument back in this room, I might remember how not to disappear by 3 in the afternoon." It was not a dramatic line. That was why it hurt. Wes understood then that whatever else Levon was trying to do, it had nothing to do with repairing his reputation. Reputation was a public currency. This was closer to sacrament. On the drive back to town, he did not speak much. Mara didn't seem to mind. At last he said, "If the work matters that much, he needs help." "Yes," she said. "He's running out of time in those hands." "Yes." "Then why in God's name isn't anybody stepping in?" Mara turned to look at him fully for the first time since leaving Bellamy House. "Because stepping in and taking over are not the same thing." Wes stared through the windshield. "Sometimes they have to be." "That," Mara said, "is exactly what a man like you would believe." He parked outside Levon's place harder than necessary and got out before the engine had fully settled. Coda followed, no longer intent, no longer calm, just attentive. Levon was in the yard by the workshop, trying to lift a crate of hardwood offcuts with one shoulder turned awkwardly against the weight. He set it down when he saw Wes coming and straightened with visible annoyance. "You drive like a man delivering bad news." "Maybe I am." Levon's eyes narrowed. "What did you do?" "I went to Bellamy House." The silence that followed was so total even the trees seemed to hold themselves still. Then Levon said, very softly, "That wasn't yours." "No," Wes answered, "but neither is this whole martyr act you've got going." Mara got out of the truck then, closing the door with more care than either man deserved. Levon looked from one to the other and went pale beneath the weather in his face. "You had no right." "I had enough," Wes said. 7 residents are waiting on instruments you may not physically be able to finish, and you'd rather die noble than let anyone know why you're failing. Color rose again in Levon, sharp and dangerous. "I would rather fail honestly than be paraded." "Paraded? I'm talking about help. You're talking about exposure. There's a difference men with uniforms rarely bother learning." Wes took a step closer. "This isn't about your pride anymore." Levon's laugh came out as something harsher than humor. "It never was about pride. That's the cheap version of what people say when they don't understand dignity." Mara moved between them, not dramatically, just enough to force both men to reevaluate their next inch. "Stop," she said. Neither did. Wes's voice dropped. "There are people down there who need those instruments." "And they will have them," Levon snapped. "With what hands?" That struck. For a moment, Levon had no answer, only the terrible exposure of a body that had begun betraying the vows its skill once made possible. Mara looked at Wes, and when she spoke her tone had changed from sharp to exact. "Not everyone who's drowning wants to be dragged ashore to applause. Some people would rather keep their own hands on the oars, even if it breaks them." The words did not end the argument. They did something worse. They made room inside it. Wes looked at Levon, really looked this time. Not at the stubbornness, not at the damage, not even at the unfinished work waiting in the workshop, but at the man standing in the yard with autumn light on his face and fury, standing guard over a promise he had not made for praise. The air had gone cold enough to sting. No one spoke after that. Levon turned first and went into the workshop without slamming the door, which somehow felt more final than if he had. Wes stood in the yard a moment longer with Coda beside him, and Mara a few feet away, the three of them held in that suspended northern light where nothing softened and nothing lied. He had come ready to solve a problem. Instead, for the first time since entering Alder Creek, he was forced to consider the more humiliating possibility that helping this man might require him to surrender the shape of help he trusted most. And he hated that idea enough to know it was probably true. The next morning, Wes did not go back to Levon's house with an argument. That, in itself, felt like a kind of labor. He woke before dawn in the motel, pulled on his green t-shirt and black jeans in the gray half-light, and sat on the edge of the bed long enough to recognize what had changed. The urge to fix had not left him. It had only been stripped of its certainty. That made it heavier. In his experience, uncertainty was what came before mistakes or wisdom, and the two often wore each other's coats for the first mile. Coda watched him from the window, where the dog had posted himself to monitor the parking lot, the road, and whatever private weather his handler was carrying in his chest. "You're enjoying this," Wes muttered. Coda blinked once, which could have meant anything or nothing. Dogs had the grace to avoid defending themselves. Wes drove up Birch Road with a roll of roofing felt, a box of exterior screws, 2 replacement hinges, and enough coffee in a paper cup to qualify as punishment. He had no invitation. He had, however, a rough inventory in his head of the things Levon's place needed that could be repaired without touching a single instrument, promise, or nerve ending too directly. Levon was already outside. He stood beside the workshop, splitting narrow kindling from a warped scrapboard with a small hand hatchet. The motion was careful and unspectacular. He looked over when the truck stopped, then at the supplies in the bed, then back at Wes with the bleak patience of a man who had once again been proven correct about other people. "I said, no parade," he called. "This isn't a parade," Wes answered, climbing down. "It's weatherproofing." Levon's mouth tightened. That's how occupations usually begin. Wes ignored that. He looked up at the workshop eave, where a gutter joint had pulled loose and rain had left dark stains down the siding. "Your roof edge is taking water. Your back latch is hanging by one screw. The porch step shifts when you hit it wrong. I was hoping neglect might fix itself if I gave it enough privacy." Wes set the coffee on the hood. "You want me to leave?" Levon hesitated a fraction too long. "No," he said at last, irritated by the answer before it had fully left him. "I want you to stop asking questions like a decent man." That was permission in the only dialect Levon respected. The morning passed in practical silence. Wes rehung the workshop latch, replaced one hinge on the side gate, and reset the loose porch board with fresh screws. Levon did not thank him. He also did not interfere beyond muttering occasional criticisms about screw length, wood grain, and the moral decline of modern hardware. It was, in its own crooked way, the most companionable they had yet been. Coda moved between house and workshop like a quiet line of connection no one had agreed to acknowledge. He lay in the doorway while Wes worked, then wandered to the woodpile, then back to the porch. At one point, Levon came out carrying a sack of cracked black walnuts for some reason, known only to old men and squirrels, and Coda rose to walk beside him across the yard without being called. Levon glanced down at the dog. "You're very persistent company." Coda leaned lightly against his knee just once and moved on. Something changed in Levon's face then. Not a smile, nothing so easy, but a loosening. A man might live years inside his own guardedness and still be betrayed by one small, wordless kindness that asks for nothing in return. Around mid-morning, Mara Quinn drove up in a battered blue wagon full of folding chairs. She got out wearing a brown wool coat over a striped shirt and jeans, A pencil stuck through the knot of her hair as though she had forgotten it there while trying to organize 3 other people's lives. She took in the scene. Wes on a ladder, Levon pretending not to supervise, Coda asleep under the truck, and lifted one eyebrow. "Well," she said, "look at that. Civilization, but homemade." Levon braced one hand on the porch rail. "If you've come to narrate, charge admission." "I've come because Ada asked if we could borrow chairs from the church annex for a trial music afternoon next week. The church said yes. The annex said no, so now I'm solving the problem with theft and charm. Your usual ministry." Mara glanced at Wes. "You haven't ruined anything important yet?" "Only my own instincts." "Good. They needed sanding." She stayed 10 minutes, maybe 15, just long enough to help unload the chairs by the shed, and mention, too casually to be casual, that Nolan had found 2 old canvas canopies in the Veterans Hall basement, and that the Bellamy House lawn might hold them if somebody knew how to set poles straight. Wes recognized the tactic for what it was. Mara was building a bridge out of errands, hoping nobody would notice it was a bridge until they were already halfway across. Levon noticed. Of course he did. "I am not hosting a town revival," he said. Mara shouldered 2 folded chairs and looked at him over the rims of her glasses. "No one asked you to. We're talking about one afternoon, a few residents, some air, a reason to sit upright in public." He said nothing to that, which was its own form of listening. By noon, Wes had finished all the repairs he could justify without trespassing into symbolism. He washed his hands at the outdoor spigot while Levon stood in the workshop doorway with a rag tucked into one pocket and sawdust on one sleeve. Neither man seemed eager to mention the fact that the place looked steadier than it had that morning. "Bellamy House at 2, Mara said, climbing back into her wagon. "Ada wants to test whether Mr. Halbrook's dog can improve attendance more effectively than my event flyers." Coda lifted his head at the sound of his irrelevance being discussed. Levon snorted softly. "That dog probably could." The remark slipped out so unguarded that Wes looked up. Levon looked away at once, as if he had accidentally left a door open in bad weather. That moment stayed with Wes all the way to Bellamy House. The afternoon there had none of the strain of the day before. No revelations, no moral indictments, just the long, patient work of being in a room where loneliness had been given furniture and expected to behave itself. Ada had set chairs in a wide half-circle near the windows. A tray of oatmeal cookies sat untouched on the side table beside a plastic pitcher of lemonade no one wanted in October. Leland Voss was already there, cardigan buttoned precisely, cane propped against his chair, wearing the skeptical expression of a man who had agreed to hope only on a trial basis. Beside him sat a narrow woman in a lavender sweater with silver hair braided down her back, her hands folded over each other in the disciplined way of someone who had once taught children or managed a choir. Ada introduced her as Mrs. Evelyn Harker, though she waved away the formality and told Wes to call her Evelyn if he insisted on talking to her at all. Coda entered the room without fanfare and immediately changed its center of gravity. Not because everyone adored dogs. One man in the back muttered that shepherds shed like bad memories. Another resident with thick glasses watched cautiously from behind a crossword puzzle. But Coda understood rooms the way some musicians understood silence. He did not go to the loudest person or the loneliest-looking one in the most obvious way. He moved where the strain was highest and the demand lowest. He stopped first by Evelyn. She had been staring out the window at the lake with that fixed, polished distance older people sometimes wore when they were trying not to let others see how tired they were of afternoons. Coda rested his chin lightly against her knee. That was all. Evelyn inhaled sharply, then laughed once under her breath. embarrassed by the sound of it. "Well," she murmured, laying a careful hand behind his ear. "Someone has very poor judgment in women." Leland barked a laugh at that, and the room, stiff until then, shifted. Later, while Ada tuned the borrowed guitar and Mara wrestled with a folding music stand that refused to believe in geometry, Coda crossed to the man with the crossword puzzle. He sat beside his chair until the puzzle lowered an inch, then another. By the time Ada asked whether anyone remembered the first verse of Red River Valley, the man had set the paper aside entirely. No miracle arrived. That was what made the hour feel true. Voices cracked, chords went muddy. Leland took the guitar and got 3 bars into an old tune before his shoulder protested and his temper followed. Evelyn sang half a hymn and then forgot the 3rd line, at which point Mara supplied the wrong lyric on purpose and earned a room full of weak but genuine laughter. One resident fell asleep midway through the 2nd song. No one treated that as failure. Wes sat in the back with his forearms on his knees, watching the room gather itself by degrees. He had seen morale built in harsher places with worse tools, but this was something different. Not endurance. Return. Small, ungainly, and stubborn. About 2/3 of the way through, Ada crossed over and sat beside him. "He does that," she said quietly, nodding toward Coda, who was now lying between Evelyn's chair and Leland's cane like a living threshold. "What?" "He makes people stop defending themselves for a minute." Wes watched the dog. He's got no patience for performance. Maybe that's why Levon lets him near. The sentence carried more than it explained. When the gathering broke up, it did so slowly. No one rushed for doors. Leland stayed to help fold chairs despite obvious pain. Evelyn wrapped 2 cookies in a napkin and slipped them into her cardigan pocket like contraband for later. Mara wrote down the names of 3 residents who said they might come again if there were real instruments next time. Ada tucked that scrap of paper into her sleeve, as if it mattered too much to risk losing in a folder. Outside, the light had gone honey-colored over the lake. Wes loaded chairs into Mara's wagon while Coda waited near the path, alert but unhurried. "This isn't much," Wes said. Ada, standing beside the porch rail, gave him a long look. "No, it's not. That's why it has a chance." He frowned. "Grand gestures flatter the giver," she said. "Small ones make room." Back at Levon's place, Wes did not go inside. He stacked the borrowed chairs under tarp by the shed because Myra asked and because it was something his hands could understand. Levon watched from the workshop window for part of it, then disappeared again before there was any danger of gratitude becoming visible. When the last chair was set down, Wes stood in the cooling yard with Coda beside him and looked toward the workshop. He thought of the letters under the table, of the files at Bellamy House, of Leland saying he might remember how not to disappear by 3 in the afternoon. He thought of Levon carrying shame like a private religion, and of Coda returning to him without agenda day after day, as if the dog understood something the rest of them were still circling. Maybe that was the whole thing. Maybe Coda stayed because shame frightened human beings more than it frightened dogs. A dog could lie at the threshold of it, breathe beside it, refuse to dramatize it, and in doing so make it less sovereign. Wes had spent years believing courage was motion. Standing there in the gold decline of an Alder Creek afternoon, he only began, to suspect that sometimes courage looked more like remaining within sight of what hurt, without trying to own it, solve it, or turn it into a lesson before it was ready. And if that was true, then the smartest creature in this whole town might be the one with fur on his boots and no use at all for speeches. The weather turned without theatrics. There was no green sky, no warning siren, no cinematic hush before the world decided to rearrange itself. By late afternoon, the light simply thinned in a different way, and the lake lost its color. The blue went out of it first, then the silver. What remained looked like something held under steel. The birches above the road had been noisy all day, but by dusk they had gone tense and whisperless, as if the trees had heard something coming long before the people had. Wes noticed because Coda did. The dog had spent most of the day in that loose, watchful state he reserved for places he had accepted without relaxing in. But around 5, he rose from the motel rug, crossed to the window, and stood there with his head slightly lowered, eyes fixed on the parking lot and the dark ridge beyond town. He did not bark. He did not pace. He just watched, and in the stillness of that watching, Wes felt the old shift inside himself, the tightening of instinct around an unnamed change. By 6, the first hard gusts were coming off the lake. He drove up Birch Road without deciding to. The truck rocked once on the curve above the old orchard. Dead leaves skittered over the windshield like thrown cards. The clouds had sunk low enough to erase the ridgeline, and the last daylight was caught in them like bruising under skin. When he turned onto Levon's lane, one loose branch cartwheeled across the ruts ahead of him and vanished into the ditch. The workshop light was on. That was the first thing he saw. The second was the roof. One section of the outer edge, not large but badly placed, had peeled up where the old flashing met the corner seam. The tar paper beneath it snapped and flapped in the wind like a trapped animal. Rain had begun, not a steady storm yet, but cold, slanting spit blown hard enough to sting, when Wes stepped out of the truck. Coda was on the ground before the door fully opened. "Stay close," Wes said, though the dog had no intention of doing anything else. He cut across the yard at a run. The porch lantern was out. The side gate banged once against its new hinge and held. From inside the workshop came a dull crash, then silence. Wes shoved the door open. The room smelled wrong. Not of resin and spruce this time, but of wet wood, cold air, and the metallic scent of fresh panic carefully suppressed. One of the upper windows had leaked at the corner. A towel had already been stuffed beneath the sill. On the floor near the bench lay a tin of clamps and a spilled box of bridge blanks. Levon was trying to right a stack of narrow spruce boards with one hand, while the other pressed hard against his side, as if holding himself in place by force. "You shouldn't be lifting that," Wes said. Levon turned too sharply and caught the edge of the bench with his hip. The impact made him go white under the weather in his face, but he answered in the same rough tone he used for every form of vulnerability. "You shouldn't come into other people's buildings like a deputy with abandonment issues. The roof's open. I noticed." Another gust hit. Something on the outside edge banged and shuddered. Wes moved past him to the far wall and looked up. Water had found its way in along the seam, and begun marking the siding beneath it in dark, diagonal lines. Not a flood, not disaster, but enough. Enough to ruin things slowly and expertly if left alone through the night. "We need to tarp it from the outside," he said. Levon laughed once, bitter and exhausted. "We?" Wes turned. "Yes, unless you've hired angels." Coda stood near the door, dripping rainwater in a small black pool, ears forward, gaze moving between the two men. He looked less like a pet than a third witness who had already filed his opinion and was waiting for the humans to catch up. Levon set the boards down with visible effort. "The blue tarp's in the shed." "Good. It's probably under the fertilizer sacks." "Better. You'll need the ladder from the back wall." "Fine." Levon took one step toward the door, and his right hand failed him. It was not dramatic. There was no cry, no collapse, just one clean betrayal at the level of muscle. His fingers lost hold of the clamp he was carrying, and it struck the floor with a sharp metal crack that seemed louder than the storm. For a second, neither man moved. Then Levon bent to retrieve it and couldn't quite close his hand. Wes got there first. He picked up the clamp and set it on the bench without comment. Levon stayed where he was, staring at the floorboards as if they had become suddenly complicated. Rain rattled harder at the window. Coda crossed the room and stood beside him, not touching, only present. Levon drew a breath through his nose. "Don't." Wes knew he wasn't talking to the dog, so he said nothing. The silence that followed was different from the ones they had shared before. Not hostile, not even guarded exactly. It had the raw, airless quality of a room after glass breaks. Everything still technically standing, but altered in a way nobody can deny. At last, Levon straightened. "The ladder," he said. They worked fast because weather did not care about pride. Wes hauled the ladder through the rain and set it against the workshop wall while Levon held the base with both hands and stubbornness standing in for stability. Coda paced once beneath the eaves, water darkening his coat, then settled under the porch overhang with his eyes never leaving them. The wind came in crosswise bursts that turned every task into an argument. By the time Wes reached the roofline, his t-shirt was damp down the spine and his fingers had gone numb around the hammer. "Left corner," Levon called over the noise. "It's the seam there, not the whole sheet." Wes forced the tar paper flat, swung the hammer twice and shouted back, "You could have told me sooner." "You didn't ask politely." That was absurd enough to steady something in him. They got the tarp fastened low and wide, enough to hold through the night if the wind didn't get ambitious. When Wes climbed down, Levon was sitting on an overturned bucket by the wall beneath the eaves, one forearm across his ribs, rain dripping from his hair. He looked smaller than usual in wet clothes, not weaker exactly, but reduced to scale by weather and fatigue. "Inside," Wes said. "I'm not dying of inconvenience." "No," Wes answered. "You're just auditioning for it." Levon would normally have had a reply sharp enough to cut paint. This time, he only pushed himself up and went in. Wes lit the workshop stove while Levon changed into a dry flannel shirt from somewhere in the house. The storm built properly then. The rain came steady. Branches scraped the roof. Once, something thudded hard against the outer wall and rolled away into the dark. The room glowed in lamplight and firelight, tools throwing long, narrow shadows across the boards. The whole place felt less like a workshop than the inside of an old instrument itself. Hollowed, resonant, holding against pressure. Levon came back with his hair still wet at the temples, and his face scrubbed clean of whatever weather had left there. He lowered himself onto the stool at the bench and looked at his hands. They were steady for 40 years, he said. It was the first time he had offered vulnerability without wrapping barbed wire around it first. Wes leaned against the stove with a towel around his neck and waited. Levon flexed his fingers once. Longer, maybe. Hard to count years, honestly, after 60. The wind hit the tarp outside. The roof answered with a low, strange shiver. "I used to think work could correct a man," Levon said. "Not morally. I'm not sentimental enough for that. But structurally, like truing a warped neck or resetting a seam before it widened." He let out a short breath. "Turns out there are some things you can only build around." Wes did not interrupt. He knew better now than to rush a man speaking from the edge of something he had defended for years. Levon looked down at the mandolin body on the bench, the one closest to finished, the one whose top plate had already been braced and joined, waiting for careful hands at the final stages. "My wife used to tell me I measured too much," he said. "Said I could take the romance out of sunlight if you gave me a ruler." There was no smile in the memory, but there was affection. Old, worn, still alive. "She had a heart condition," he continued. Not the kind people die from dramatically at first. The slow kind. The kind that teaches a household to negotiate with fear until fear starts paying rent. The room seemed to grow quieter around that. Some mornings were fine, some weren't. That day, he stopped, not for effect, but because the words themselves appeared to have weight. That day she said she was all right, pale, tired, but all right. I had a violin plate and clamps. 1 customer behind, 2 if you counted promises. I told myself I'd finish the gluing, make tea, and then we'd go in if she still looked bad. Rain tapped hard at the upper pane. Coda had moved closer to the stove now, but his head was still lifted, eyes fixed on Levon. She sat in the kitchen with that blue scarf wrapped twice around her throat, Levon said. Kept insisting I stop looking at her like a mechanic listening to a bad engine. She told me to finish the work. Said not every discomfort deserved an ambulance and a bill to match. His mouth tightened. I believed her because I wanted to. He let that sit between them. When I finally called, it had already turned, fast, faster than the body has any right to fail after years of warning you politely. Wes looked down at his own hands. Big hands. Capable hands. Hands that had opened doors under fire and zipped body bags and written letters nobody wanted. He knew the sound of retrospective guilt too well not to recognize its grammar in another man's voice. She might have died anyway, Levon said, almost angrily. That's the filth of it. I will never know whether I failed her in fact or only in timing. But there are men who can live with not knowing. I discovered I wasn't one of them. The stove popped softly. So, the fundraiser, Wes said quietly. Levon nodded once. A month later, people had counted on me. Instruments promised, auction pieces half done, names attached to my name. I stood in this room with wood on the bench and could not make my hands belong to me. I thought if I stepped into that hall, everyone would see exactly what I had become. He gave a dry, ruined laugh. Instead, I let them see something worse. Cowardice dressed as mourning. The line from the letters returned in Wes's mind, but he did not say it. Levon reached toward the mandolin and let his fingertips rest on the unfinished edge. Everything after that got built on the wrong foundation. For a long time the storm spoke for them. Then Wes crossed the room, pulled up the second stool and sat. My father died while I was on assignment, he said. Levon did not look at him, but he listened. They called twice. I got the second message 6 hours late because we were moving. Wes rolled the towel once between his hands. He wasn't a poetic man, not someone who needed final speeches, but I'd told myself there'd be time. 1 more week, 1 more operation, 1 more flight home when things were cleaner. He looked toward the rain-black window. There's always 1 more until there isn't. Levon's head lowered by a fraction. It was not agreement, something quieter. Recognition, maybe, the exhausted courtesy of 2 men admitting they had both been late to the wrong door. On the bench, the mandolin waited. Its neck lay wrapped in cloth beside the body. The bridge blank had been rough cut. Fine work remained, fitting, checking, gluing under pressure. Small decisions where a trembling hand mattered more than muscle. Levon said, without looking up, "Hand me the spool clamps." Wes did. That was all the permission there was. They worked in the stormlight and the stove glow, not as savior and saved, not even as friends yet, but as 2 men holding a line together because weather had stripped away the luxury of pretending 1 pair of hands was enough. Levon measured. Wes steadied. Levon marked the fit in pencil. Wes held the neck true, while the older man adjusted the angle in movement so precise they bordered on prayer. Once Levon's hand shook, and Wes caught the body before it slid. Neither acknowledged it. Coda lay beneath the bench at some point, chin on his paws, as if to guard the small sacredness of labor honestly shared. By the time the worst of the wind had passed, the mandolin's last difficult joint was set under clamp pressure, neat and exact. Levon leaned back on the stool and closed his eyes once. "Good work," Wes said before he could stop himself. Levon opened them again. In the lamplight, the old man looked less defended than tired, and less tired than relieved. "Don't make a habit of approval," he murmured. "It spoils a room." But the bite had gone out of the words. Outside, the rain softened to a steady lesser sound. Inside, the workshop held, the roof held, the stove held, the instrument on the bench held. Nothing had been forgiven. Nothing had been solved. And yet, in that battered room under a weather-beaten roof, something had shifted from solitary endurance into shared weight. Neither man named it. They didn't need to. The afternoon arrived clear enough to feel deliberate. After the storm, the sky had washed itself into a hard autumn blue, and the lake behind Bellamy House held the light like hammered silver. The wind had gone mild, almost embarrassed by what it had done the night before. Birch leaves drifted loose in lazy spirals across the grass. The lawn east of the building, the one Ada had claimed for the gathering, looked too open for memory and too plain for ceremony, which, Wes thought, was probably why it had a chance. He was there early with Nolan Pierce and 2 canvas canopies that smelled of mildew, old rope, and Veterans Hall storage. Nolan moved slower than usual, but with the same dry competence, his iron-gray head bent against the poles, as if all difficult things could be improved by square corners and measured force. "You set one more stake crooked," Nolan said, "and Ada will have my hide. She'll have mine first. She'll multitask." That was as close to encouragement as Nolan ever came. Mara Quinn arrived 10 minutes later in her battered wagon with folding chairs, sheet music, 2 thermoses, and a wooden crate full of paper cups. She had traded her usual cardigan for a rust-colored coat, and the wind had already pulled half her hair loose from whatever arrangement she'd attempted that morning. She took one look at Wes and Nolan wrestling a canopy leg into alignment and said, "Good. I was hoping this would look less like an event and more like a barn repair with emotional consequences." "It's under control," Wes said. Those are famous last words where canopies are involved. Coda moved between them all with the settled dignity of a creature who already considered the afternoon worth attending. He nosed the stacked chairs, accepted a scratch from Nolan without fanfare, then trotted toward the porch where Ada stood directing traffic with a clipboard, and the expression of a woman who had learned long ago that kindness worked better when it wore boots. Bellamy House began emptying slowly. Residents came out in layers, assisted by canes, walkers, 1 wheelchair, and 100 private negotiations with stubborn joints. Leland Voss was among the first, sweater vest immaculate, hair smoothed back, a mandolin case carried by Wes because Leland had agreed only on the condition that nobody make a production of helping him. Evelyn Harker followed in a dark wool shawl, her silver braid tucked over one shoulder, looking like a woman who had accepted frailty as an insult, but not an identity. Others came more hesitantly. People whose names Wes knew now because he had heard Ada speak them aloud with equal parts patience and precision. No one had dressed for a show. That mattered. They had dressed for being seen without apology. Levon arrived last. No one announced him. No one turned the moment into a hush. Mara, bless her contrary heart, started rearranging sheet music just as his old pickup rolled into view, as if the best respect she could offer was to refuse to stage his entrance. Wes looked up from fastening one corner of the second canopy, and saw the truck stop near the edge of the lawn. Levon got out carefully, not theatrically. One hand braced on the door for half a second before he let it go. He wore a dark wool coat over a clean blue shirt, the collar open at the throat. His white hair had been combed back with actual effort, and the lines of his face seemed sharper in the bright light. Not because he was more fragile today, but because he had chosen to show up in it. Coda crossed the grass toward him immediately. Levon crouched with visible care and set one hand against the dog's neck. It was a small gesture, almost hidden by the angle of his body, but Wes saw it and knew at once that something had changed. Not healed. Changed. Levon straightened, saw Wes watching, and gave him the look of a man who would prefer his tenderness remain unreported. Wes walked over with the mandolin case. "I can carry my own mistakes," Levon said. "That one isn't a mistake." Levon took the case. For a second, his hand lingered on the handle, as if testing whether the afternoon itself was solid enough to hold. Behind them, Ada was guiding residents into chairs with the brisk calm of a field marshal who had been issued a softer battlefield. The lawn had filled more than Wes expected. A few people from town stood at the edges, too. Nolan near the back, Mara by the music stand, the young mechanic Toby Wren in a clean jacket that still held traces of engine oil no detergent could quite erase. There were others Wes recognized only by sight. A woman from the bakery, the man from the post office, one of the church volunteers with a thermos tucked under her arm. No one crowded forward. No one claimed a front-row morality they hadn't earned. They simply came and stayed. That, too, mattered. The gathering began without speechifying. Ada welcomed everyone in 3 plain sentences, thanked the weather for behaving for once, and then stepped aside. Leland was first because he insisted on it. His fingers did not move cleanly, and his shoulder forced the instrument awkwardly high. But when he plucked the opening notes of an old county tune, the sound that came out was unmistakably real, thin in places, searching in others, but undeniably alive. The first phrase snagged, the second held. By the third, something in his face had gone from concentration to memory. Evelyn sang after that. She did not have a young woman's voice, nor did the song ask her to. It had become something finer and more weathered than sweetness. Like linen washed so often it no longer hid the hand that touched it. Halfway through, she forgot a line and laughed at herself under her breath. Mara supplied the wrong lyric from her place by the stand, and the resulting laughter moved gently through the chairs like a breeze through dry grass. Nothing about the afternoon was perfect. That was what made it impossible to dismiss. Around a third of the way in, Levon still had not opened the case. He sat near the side of the gathering beneath the weaker shade of the canopy, the mandolin resting across his knees, one thumb rubbing once and again along the worn leather edge of the handle. Wes stood farther back, pretending to fuss with the coffee table so he would have a reason not to stare. He understood enough now not to mistake delay for refusal, but he also knew there was a line in every hard thing between waiting and hiding, and no one else there would be able to name it for Levon. It was Coda who did. The dog, who had spent the first half of the afternoon moving between chairs and accepting the solemn attentions of the elderly with saintly restraint, walked over to Levon and sat directly in front of him. Then he looked at the case. That was all. Levon gave a short, unbelieving breath through his nose. "You too?" Coda remained where he was. Levon's hand, thin but controlled, rested on the latches a moment longer. Then he opened the case. The mandolin inside caught the light with a low amber glow. Nothing ostentatious. Just fine wood, careful hands, and time made visible. Levon lifted it as though lifting something that had once nearly belonged to grief alone. The lawn, the residents, the people from town, all of it receded for Wes in that instant. What remained was one old man, one instrument, and the terrible courage of doing something in public that had once broken you in private. Levon played. Not brilliantly, not smoothly. His hand betrayed him twice in the first minute. The tremor showed in one chord change, and again when he reached too far and had to pull back. But the melody itself held. It was an old tune, one Wes didn't know, with the shape of river water and something homesick hidden in the middle. By the second verse, Leland was humming along. By the end, Evelyn had added a soft harmony beneath it, her voice worn and steady as flannel. When the last note faded, no one leapt to their feet. No one should have. What followed was better than applause. It was the quiet attention of people who understood exactly what it had cost and did not insult it by turning it into spectacle. Then Nolan clapped once, slow, firm. Others joined, not loudly, but long enough for the sound to become shelter instead of triumph. Wes saw then that not everyone's face had softened. Toby Wren looked moved but uncertain. The bakery woman wiped one eye and then seemed angry with herself for it. A man near the back folded his arms and stayed folded, though he did not leave. The town had not become innocent in an afternoon. That would have made the whole thing cheap. After Levon played, the instruments began passing through the gathering like small permissions. Leland took one of the finished mandolins and found, to his own disgust, that his hand still remembered more than his pride had admitted. Evelyn held the lap dulcimer with both palms first, as though warmth itself might be a prelude. One resident who had said almost nothing all week plucked 3 tentative notes on the small guitar, and then looked around with startled irritation, as if someone else had betrayed his gloom on purpose. Mara moved through the chairs with lyric sheets. Ada adjusted straps and stools with the brisk tenderness of a woman who knew that logistics, correctly handled, could amount to mercy. Nolan tuned without commentary. Even the man from the post office, who had the look of someone uncomfortable with public feeling, found himself holding a music stand steady for longer than necessary. Late in the afternoon, when the sun had lowered enough to turn the lake gold at the edges, Levon asked Ada for a pen. She handed him one without question. He set the mandolin aside, reached into his coat pocket, and drew out a folded packet of papers sealed in a manila sleeve. The sight of it made Mara go still. Wes saw Ada understand a beat before anyone else did. Levon looked at the papers, then at the workshop visible in the distance through the trees beyond the Bellamy House drive, though it was too far to see clearly. His voice when he spoke did not carry like a speech. It carried like a man making an adjustment to the grain. "When I'm done with it," he said, "the workshop goes here." The lawn seemed to gather around those words. Ada did not move at first. Levon. He lifted one hand. Not as a monument, God forbid, as a working room, repairs, adaptations. Lessons, if anyone's foolish enough to teach. The tools that still have use with them, the benches, the wood stock. What's left that can still be of service. Mara's eyes had gone bright, though her posture remained exact. Nolan removed his cap and held it against his leg. Levon turned to Ada again. "You'll know what to do with usefulness better than I did." There was no dramatic break in his voice. That made it harder on everyone else. Ada took the papers with both hands, as if receiving something fragile enough to bruise under the wrong fingers. "Are you certain?" "No," he said, "but certainty has done me limited good." A small, startled laugh escaped Evelyn. Even Ada smiled at that. Wes stood a little apart from the gathering, Coda leaning lightly against his leg, and felt a strange pressure in his chest. Not grief exactly, not relief either. something like witnessing a man stop bargaining with his own worth and place it, finally, where it might outlive him honestly. The afternoon thinned. Residents were brought back inside in pairs and slow lines. Chairs were folded, thermoses capped. One of the canopies came down crooked and had to be corrected by Nolan, while Mara accused the ropes of moral weakness. The people from town dispersed the way decent people often do when they know the moment belongs to someone else. Quietly, with their hands full of small tasks. When most of it was over, Wes found Levon standing near the edge of the lawn with the empty mandolin case in one hand and the sunset touching one side of his face. "You look tired," Wes said. "I am. Worth it?" Levon considered the lake before answering. "Ask me tomorrow when my joints file their complaints." Wes almost smiled. They stood in silence a while longer. Then Wes said, before he could edit himself into safety, "I'm staying." Levon glanced over. "Another day?" "No." The word settled between them with more weight than Wes expected. He could have softened it. He didn't. "I don't mean forever," he said. "I mean longer, through the repairs, through the workshop, however long it takes for the place to start feeling useful in the right direction." Levon looked back at the water. "That sounds dangerously like belonging." "Yeah," Wes said. "I noticed." Levon gave the smallest tilt of his head, the nearest thing to approval he had ever offered without sarcasm. By the time Wes drove back up the hill with the last of the chairs in the truck bed and Coda curled in the passenger seat, dusk had settled over Alder Creek in a deep blue wash. The workshop came into view before the house, a dark shape against darker trees. Then the light inside it came on. Not bright, not grand, just one lamp, amber through old glass, holding steady against the gathering dark. Wes cut the engine and sat for a moment without moving. Some things, he thought, were not saved by force, law, or even love in its louder forms. Some things were saved because somebody chose to keep a room ready for use after shame had finished with it, because somebody stayed, because a dog lay down at the threshold long enough for a human being to believe he could cross it again. Beside him, Coda lifted his head toward the light, then settled back down, as if the sight of it answered a question he had never worried about naming. And under that first evening of a different future, with autumn pressing close, and the workshop lamp steady in the dark, Wes understood that not every home announced itself with certainty. Some homes revealed themselves by the light that stayed on. This story reminds us that not every rescue begins with strength, and not every miracle arrives all at once. Sometimes grace looks like staying. Sometimes healing begins when one wounded soul refuses to turn away from another. And sometimes God works quietly, through a loyal dog, an open door, a steady hand, and the courage to keep one small light burning after a long season of shame. In everyday life, there may be someone near us who does not need to be fixed, but simply needs to know they have not been forgotten. That kind of faithfulness can change a life. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments what stayed with you most. And if you believe stories of hope, dignity, and quiet redemption still matter, please subscribe and stay with us for the next one. May God bless your home, steady your heart, and keep a light on for you in every dark season.